Imagine, if you will, that it's the mid to late 90s. Most of us still use dial-up internet. YouTube hasn't been invented yet. Any kind of media you want to watch online likely takes up a lot of bandwidth, so if you want to watch the trailer for Star Wars Episode 1, you'll more than likely be watching it like this. You have to understand, streaming was not a thing yet. That was years off. Hell, even DVD was a pretty new tech. You're goofing off in history class with maybe 5 minutes to spare until the next bell. The class tech nerd is trying to see if he can install Doom on the school computer when you suddenly look over his shoulder to find that he's downloading music off of something called Napster. I know I've just dated myself about 3 decades, but for you youngins, understand that at this point, the idea of downloading independent music files to your computer's hard drive just wasn't a thing. The idea of downloading for free individual songs without needing to go to the store and buy an entire album was mind-blowing. It actually became a problem in my school. So many of us were tying up bandwidth because we were spending so much time downloading MP3s. When this was new, the legality of downloading music wasn't an issue. See, I mostly used P2P file sharing sites to download music you wouldn't ordinarily get to purchase any other way, like the Final Fantasy soundtracks. Where it started to become a problem, though, was when file sharing software, like Napster, started becoming more and more popular, and kids were downloading anything and everything. Musicians started to notice, and that's when they decided to take action. You see, certain companies have zero tolerance for this kind of thing, and they'll pursue lawsuits or ban the activity outright. But this was such a new thing that individual artists decided that instead of banning P2P networking outright, they would monetize it. That's why we have things like iTunes today. But even to this day, the legality of copying and distributing songs is not always cut and dry. This especially applies to the subtle art of emulation. This goes back to the early days of VHS, but as soon as it became easy to simply duplicate a piece of media, the question of whether or not it was legal was asked around the globe. When VCRs first came out, the big movie companies tried to halt production because consumers could simply record anything off of cable, as opposed to going to the store and buying a movie for $100. Yes, buying movies back then was a luxury. Obviously, that didn't go over so well, and ever since then, people have figured out how to copy and distribute something that they only paid for once. So the question I hear a lot is emulation piracy? It really depends on who you ask. Emulation, by definition, is the act of running a piece of software on hardware that it wasn't intended to run on in the first place. Playing Super Nintendo games on your computer, for instance. There are so many ways to approach this, but let me start by asking one simple question. If you buy a game on your PlayStation 5, does that automatically entitle you to the Xbox and PC versions? Technically, the answer is no. If you want to play a game on different hardware legally, then you have to double dip. There are, of course, exceptions to this. A lot of times, if you already own, say, a PS4 game, the developer will offer the PS5 upgrade for free, or at least at a nominal fee. But there's a reason why you can't simply take a PS5 disc, pop it into your Xbox Series X, and start playing. Game developers are here to make money, yo. A lot of emulation enthusiasts who are against piracy will say that it's perfectly legal to emulate games you already own in your library. Oh, is it now? When you buy a game on your Switch, it was meant to run on one thing, your Switch. Even though Nintendo doesn't port its games to PC, by emulating the game, even if you are actually dumping your own physical card to a hard drive, you are playing the game in a way that it wasn't meant to be played. You are obtaining a second copy of the game without paying Nintendo. Believe it or not, most companies consider it a crime if you copy something you own, because when you purchase, say, a DVD or a CD, you're actually purchasing the right to use that one disc, not multiple copies of it. I don't think Warner Brothers or even Disney will come knocking on your doors anytime soon, but look it up. It's a real mentality. You're purchasing the right to use that one thing you bought. Technically, from the studio's point of view, making a copy, even if it's a backup for your own purposes, is a violation of their policy. George Lucas actually feels that when you buy a copy of Star Wars, you're basically just paying him to rent the movie from him. He owns the movie and you're just paying for the rights to see it. It's a weird, trippy thing to think about, but it muddies the waters. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what is actually legal and what isn't. Piracy is piracy, sure, but even piracy has several layers to peel through, and every case is different. Let's look at emulation, first of all. If copying something you paid money for has a weird legal loophole that you find silly or downright disagree with, then consider when you download games that you don't actually own. Games you never even thought of buying are now flooding your hard drive. But it's okay because they're older games, they're not available to purchase anymore, and no legal PC versions exist, right? Well, I don't know. This is just a discussion. Many people would tell you that it is absolutely not okay to download anything that you didn't pay for. But if we're being honest, if you're into emulation, chances are you have a full library of just about any game platform you could think of, and I'm going to guess that you don't actually own all those games. What about if you buy one of those pre-built emulation hard drives off of Amazon? I mean, they're selling these freaking things on Amazon, so it has to be legal, right? This is where I wanted to point the crux of my conversation, and I am by no means passing judgment if you buy one of these drives. I've bought one, and I am an avid user of emulation. I think emulation is a great thing, but people just feel differently about it. Now, let's say you're playing games for a console that flat out doesn't exist anymore. And by doesn't exist, I'm talking about a console that hasn't been talked about for decades, like the Atari 2600. Let's say you're emulating a game in which the programmer has sadly passed away. He passed away, so you don't have to worry about violating copyright, right? Well, let me ask you this. When the original copyright holder passes away, do the rights of their IP automatically enter the public domain? Sometimes they can, but it usually takes several decades for that to happen, like with what happened with Winnie the Pooh. But more than likely, the rights transfer over to the estate. So just because the sole programmer is no longer among the living doesn't mean that someone else doesn't own the rights. And even if we're not talking about sole ownership, what about monetarily speaking? Surely most of these Atari games are no longer being sold on any current streaming service or whatever. If the only way to play these games legally is by buying expensive physical cartridges from third parties on eBay, then emulation is a perfectly okay method to play them, right? I like the argument, but again, just because something isn't being sold to you doesn't mean it's exactly legal to play it. You're still playing a copy of a game that you never paid for, and like I discussed above, someone somewhere probably still owns the rights. More than likely. I mean, if you want to take the time to look up the ownership of every game stored on your 12 terabyte hard drive, be my guest. I'd rather spend that time playing some damn games, man. Now let's look at something a little more current. This is my SNES Classic Edition. I love this thing. And keep in mind, even though this is an officially licensed product by Nintendo, they are using a form of emulation to run these games. What, did you think this was an actual Super Nintendo, only smaller? No, you freak, it's just a little single-board computer with a few games slapped on internal storage. But Nintendo did sell this thing, so obviously, as long as you bought it, it's perfectly legal. Now let's look at the library. It's pretty solid if you ask me. We have some absolute winners here, but it's obviously missing some very memorable titles. You know what game I don't see here? One of the best beat-em-ups ever, freaking Turtles in Time. I don't know if Nintendo ever confirmed this, but the most likely reason this title wasn't included was due to one thing: licensing. Nintendo probably didn't want to pay to license out the TMNT property. And let me assure you, the Ninja Turtles is definitely not up for grabs. Last I checked, they were owned by Nickelodeon. That means that anyone who wants to use the TMNT license has to pay Nickelodeon something. That includes people who emulate the game or got it with their pre-built emulation drives. It is an old game from the early 90s, yes, but if Nintendo has to pay a license every time they want to distribute it, what makes you think you have the right to play it for free? Again, going back to my physical media argument, I get it. If you pay an exorbitant price for the actual cartridge on eBay from Kitty Kitty Lick Lick 6969, Nintendo or whoever doesn't actually get paid. But you are still paying to own that one cartridge. If you dump the ROM file to your computer, technically, you own Nintendo, something? And what about the more obvious choices? Your Sonic games, your Marios, your Zeldas, Metroids, all those licensed sports games that were a dime a dozen back in the 90s. Some of these games are readily available somewhere in digital form. Hell, you might even be able to find them on a cheap compilation disc. But you bet your bottom that Nintendo frowns on anyone who emulates any of their Mario games on anything not distributed by them. Well, maybe not the CDI Mario game. They probably don't care if you emulated that. Or the 3 Zelda games. But if you're buying one of these emulation drives that come packed with 40,000 games, I'm damn skippy that somewhere on that drive you'll find a Mario game or two that you don't actually own. And I'm pretty sure when you get your nice fancy drive in the mail, you hop right on and delete every title that you don't actually own on your shelf, right? Isn't that what you spent your hard-earned dollars on? A big hard drive just so you can have digital copies of the 20 games you actually own? Screw the 50,000 titles that were advertised. You want to do this legit, so go ahead and just format the whole drive, why don't you? I'm not trying to guilt anyone, but there are so many things to think about that aren't really being discussed when it comes to this topic. Let's look at the big game that everyone was emulating last year. The game that got a certain emulation developer in big trouble with Nintendo and caused waves within the emulation community. I'm talking about Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Granted, I think the thing that got the Yuzu developers in trouble was the fact that they put up a paywall so that people could pay for the privilege to accurately emulate the game, which is a huge no-no. You won't get far if you try to monetize something you don't have the rights to. Naughty, naughty, Yuzu developers. You really should have seen that one coming. Not that I'm cheering on Nintendo. I frown on any large corporate entity that goes after the little guy, even if the little guy is technically in the wrong. But my point is this. When Tears of the Kingdom came out and everyone was emulating it on their PCs, a lot of these emulation hard drives came bundled with Tears of the Kingdom. And most YouTubers I saw reviewing these devices made comments about how they felt sketchy that a drive they bought from China came bundled with the latest Zelda game. But if these drives came with Tears of the Kingdom, you know what other game probably came with it? That other open-world Zelda title, Breath of the Wild. Except when it came to that title, I didn't hear anyone complaining about that. There are certain YouTubers who frowned at emulating anything for the Switch because it's still a relevant piece of hardware, but I got the feeling that they were putting a statute of limitations, so to speak, on a game that was barely 5 years old. Why would it be okay to emulate Breath of the Wild, but suddenly shady to emulate Tears of the Kingdom? Because it was new, I guess. But let me tell you something. Both of these games are still being sold by Nintendo at their full retail prices, so why is it okay to emulate either game? If you're so against piracy in the first place, then you really should be buying these games, either digitally or otherwise, and playing them on a Switch. I don't care what kind of rig you have. If you're running an i9 with an RTX 7090 Ti, I know that doesn't exist, but I'm being sarcastic for the hell of it. The game is still more than likely going to run better on actual hardware because guess what? That's what it was designed for. Now let's talk about what most people agree is piracy, playing free copies of PC games. Uh-oh, I think I just hit a nerve, and my dentist appointment isn't for another month. Obviously, if you don't support piracy, then you're going to be against downloading a game from, say, a torrent site. It's pretty easy to do, but there are always several caveats if you're the kind of crooked, vile sociopath who engages in that kind of activity. You know who you are. First of all, the obvious one, some games use that advanced copy protection stuff to make it extremely hard to crack the game. So there will probably be a certain game you want to run that just isn't crackable, and you'll have to just deal with paying for it. Oh, boo-hoo, cry me a river. I guess you'll have to resort to robbing banks, you low-life criminal mastermind. But in all seriousness, if you pirate a game that is cracked so you can run it without actually buying it from Steam or whatever, you can give up any hope of playing it online. From my understanding, online servers are pretty sophisticated at knowing who's playing a cracked version of the game. It's not worth getting a lifetime ban over, even if it is what you deserve for copying the game, you low-life ex-con jailbird weirdo. Also, when you pirate a PC game or any game that you didn't buy officially, really there's usually no easy way to get an update. If you download a Switch game, for example, and you run it on Yuzu, if you want the latest update available to the people who cared enough to actually buy the game, you obviously can't go onto Nintendo servers and update the game. You have to go online and find the update file yourself and patch the game on your own. It's doable, but it's not intuitive, and it's a good way to run into viruses or, at the very least, fill your hard drive with a lot of useless files. PC games are pretty much the same thing. If you want the most current update, you have to find a site that hosts the update and hope that the file you need matches the original file you downloaded. Different hackers use different cracking methods, so just because you have a update file doesn't mean it'll work with your version of the game. And even when you update, there's no telling if it's the most recent or stable update, so you'll more than likely always be a few versions behind what's currently available on the actual marketplace. So, if you happen to buy one of these emulation drives that comes with free PC games, keep in mind that by the time you're using the drive, they're probably older versions. Take one of my favorite recent PC games, Cyberpunk 2077. I'm actually doing a video on this game, so you have that to look forward to. All 11 of you, that is. I actually bought the game on Steam. See, there it is, just to prove it to you. Last year, when the Phantom Liberty DLC came out, the game came with a huge update that totally revamped the entire experience. I bought that Kinhank 12TB gaming hard drive that everyone talks about, and it comes with Cyberpunk. And it's one of the earliest versions of the game. You know, when the game was virtually unplayable due to a host of bugs and glitches. If I wanted to update this version, I'd have to put on my black spray paint, dress up like a ninja, sneak into the back alleys of torrent sites where only bums and crazed lunatics wander, and download a separate version of the game with all the recent updates. And even after doing all that, Hyperspin is a pretty finicky front end, so there'd be no telling if the game would even run with all the new executables. Now, the game on Steam, which I believe only cost $30 at the time for both the base game and Phantom Liberty, just updates automatically whenever CD Projekt Red puts out an update. It's easy, and I don't have to worry about all the other bugs I might experience if I were to play some weird cracked version of the game. That's the other thing that actually pisses me off about these emulation drives. Did you ever open one of these drives, connect it to your computer, open the software, and realize, whoa, it even comes with some PS4 and PS5 games? Well, I've got news for you. Development on the PS4 emulator is nowhere good enough to run something like God of War or Spider-Man. So whenever you see these pop up, rest assured you're playing a pirated version of the PC port of these games. Most of you are probably well aware of that, but that's the one thing I'm annoyed by, truly, when I see PS4 and PS5 games listed on these rather expensive drives. Please, China, Ken Hank, whoever, stop misrepresenting what you're selling. I've gone through your list of Xbox games. I know they're actually PS2 ROMs disguised as Xbox games. Shame on you. Naughty, naughty, Ken Hank. Now again, I'm not commenting on my personal stance on piracy. If you're comfortable with it and you're having fun with it, emulation or otherwise, have fun with it. By all means, emulation just opens another avenue of gaming, and yes, oftentimes, legal or not, it does offer a plethora of games that you would have no other way of playing. Just understand that there's a gray area for a reason. There's a lot to consider here. And while I love the idea of having a small portable drive that contains thousands of games, you will never in your lifetime play all of them. It looks nice in an arcade cabinet. You can impress your clueless friends who've probably never touched a video game in their life. But at the end of the day, if you're not enjoying the games, who cares? Back in the 90s, I knew a guy who actually owned a modded PlayStation. For those who don't know about this, back when CD burners were a thing, you couldn't actually play pirated or burned PlayStation games on a vanilla PlayStation. The console simply wouldn't load the disc. That is, unless you knew someone who was good at soldering. In that case, you could buy what was commonly referred to as a mod chip and have it soldered to the internal circuitry of your PS1, in which case, then, yes, you could play most burned PlayStation games. This guy had connections with FuncoLand, Blockbuster Video, you name it. He even had imported games from Japan that he would just burn to a blank disc and play. I was at his house the day he got the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VIII. It was all in Japanese, and neither of us knew how to play the game, but he had it about 6 months before it hit U.S. shores. The thing was, he had binders upon binders full of burned PlayStation games, well over 600 titles. How many of those games do you think he actually beat? Last I checked, 0. He had so many games to choose from, it was impossible for him to sink his teeth into one good game. So my advice to anyone new to emulation is this. I know owning the entire Amiga CD32 collection is enticing as hell, but at the end of the day, consider how many of those games you'll actually devote any real time to. My guess is none, if we're talking about the Amiga CD32, but if your thing is the Genesis or the SNES, both of which have over 700 titles in their respective libraries, if you actually have access to the full libraries, you'll never find that hidden gem that you love for hours. And that's what I truly miss about the days when you could only afford a couple games a year. You had to make the most out of them because one single game cost as much as a 1 terabyte hard drive loaded with thousands of games does today. So rather than worry about downloading hundreds of thousands of games, setting up these really complicated front ends that host hundreds of emulators, what you should really do is focus on the systems you really want to play and find the games that mean the most to you. At the end of the day, it's all about what you're playing and just loving whatever it is that you're playing. I'm tall, dark, and retro, and I approve this message. Thanks for watching.